I've been talking a lot lately about how Nintendo completely butchered the localization for The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom. For some reason, they decided to present the Deku Scrubs as a bunch of they thems, which contradicts established lore and established canon and goes against what we know of their culture and how they act and what they are, right? It's just completely ridiculous and is obviously faked and forced to push an agenda, right? The woke agenda, the communist Marxist thing that is trying to pervasively infiltrate our entire culture and degenderize everything, right? This is just another example of how woke culture ruins video games. And I don't see anyone talking about it, right? We're at the point now where, like, I'm at the end of the game, and for some reason, the characters are referring to the antagonist as a they them, which is ridiculous. Like, they also do this thing where, like, they call like eldritch abomination things like thems, like they're legion or some fucking shit. Like it's not applicable, right? It is completely fake. It doesn't make any sense. It's something that's forced. It's something that's being pushed by the industry to try and normalize they thems into popular culture. It's trying to make people think that they thems are an actual proper way to refer to an individual as opposed to being like a communist cope to try and degenderize language, right? Again, the they them thing is fake and gay. And I think the easiest way to prove that is to examine just what the rules are, right? What exactly do all of these they thems have in common, right? What do Deku Scrubs have in common with Null? Okay, what does Juniper have in common with Act? What does Kaiza have in common with any of these other characters, right? All of these Nintendo they thems, right? If you actually look at who they are, how they act, how they treat other people, how they interact with other people, their designs, their characters, right? It's all just indiscriminate, right? It's all just a big cope, right? Because there is no rhyme or reason for it. Like all of these characters have absolutely nothing in common, right? The localizers just shove they thems onto them in order to try and pass that off as if it's a proper way to refer to an individual, right? So Kaiza can't just be gay because he's like kind of effeminate. They have to call him a they them. Keep in mind, Kaiza is explicitly a man in the original localization for Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn, so they can't even like try and pass it off as if like, oh, we were different. That like no, the way you're doing it now is wrong. Act was I think Act was like explicitly stated to be female in Splatoon 2. It was one of the only things we knew about her, right? And what do they do in Splatoon 3? Try to pass her off as a they them? Like why? It's just it's just a big cope. It's just a big cope. Juniper, like Kite's gonna like openly lust after her Agnusi, and yet you're going to try and pass her off as non-binary. And like you're gonna make some weird conspiracy theory up about how like, oh, she's female in the code, bro, when actually it has something to do with how like she's non-binary in the code. Yeah, like she's labeled like differently in the code because she starts off as an antagonistic unit and then like she becomes friendly like afterward, right? Or something like that. I don't know exactly. Like the whole like, oh, Juniper's non-binary in the code is a complete cope and has no basis in reality at all. Like people have straight up like debunked that notion, right? And we've had like other examples too, characters that like people have made up like fan fiction theories of being non-binary. I think A from Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is an example. I think is her name A. Like again, that was debunked by an art book, right? So to me, it seems very evident that the localizers are getting away with throwing they thems into games, but like it's not necessarily having like an impact at all, right? And I do think a big reason for that is just by like using them indiscriminately the way they are with no real rhyme or reason. Like they're probably just trying to pass it off as being quirky or like being accurate or being technically like truer to the Japanese because Japanese doesn't really have like gendered language like we do, right? So it's like they try um they try everything they possibly can to normalize this, but the more they do it, the more people like me are going to start calling them out on it. Like their propaganda is not effective. And I do think a big reason for that is because there is no consistency in how they go about this, right? They can't just label an animal as a they them, a creature as a they them, and expect people to not to call them out on it. Because, like, when you see a creature, you call it, or alternatively use masculine pronouns, right? You don't call it a they them unless you're a university indoctrinated Marxist shill. Okay, that's the only situation in which you do that. In which it is if you're so into that culture where you genuinely believe singular they them pronouns are a thing, right? And it's completely wrong. It's a complete cope. But more and more people are figuring this out, right? Like again, it's just not gonna work. I think um, it's already falling apart. People either don't notice or assume it's a mistake. Is my experience with seeing this in action, and it is a mistake, right? If localizers are doing their jobs incorrectly and not like giving appropriate pronouns to characters, then yes, it is a mistake, right? Yamato is a girl, regardless of what the English localization team tries to pass her off as. Actually, that's a really good example. Like, weren't they like really adamant that Yamato was a man? Only to get wrecked by like an official Japanese thing, like a Vivre card that was like easily translated to like demonstrate that Yamato is female, right? She specifically does say she's female. Like, she has giant boobs. She's referred to as Kaido's daughter. Like, what exactly is so difficult to understand about this? Like, oh, but she calls herself Kozuki Oden, who is a man. Like, it's called role play, you fucking retard. Like, again, you have no idea. No idea. No respect for the source material at all. Like, throwing labels onto characters is never, ever going to work, especially if they're previously established. And I do think this is going to be a big problem with Nintendo properties in general. Is this like, if they try and pass off Kirby as a they them, like they're going to completely epically fail because Kirby is like a really good example of like of how the they them thing was not a real thing because like Kirby isn't supposed to be male or female, right? He's just a Kirby thing, right? He's an alien creature, but we use masculine pronouns for him because that's what you're supposed to do for creatures like him is just default to masculine pronouns. And that's been clearly demonstratable in like the entire history of Kirby, right? Is that you always refer to him with masculine pronouns. But it's uh it's one of those things where um the communists are just really really going to struggle like changing the way like established characters are viewed, right? And I do think this is the big issue right now is that like right now they're only doing this with characters that like nobody cares about, random Pokemon evolutions, random characters in random games that are contradicted by other games or other like published material, right? And sometimes it's contradicted by like art books and stuff like that. Like I think Xenoblade Chronicles 3 had uh had some issues with that. So like if you have like a bunch of Marxists just being completely incapable of controlling every aspect of the brand and its history, like they're never ever going to have absolute control over how these characters are viewed. And the way things are going now, even like the new characters that they're coming up with, characters whose entire popularity revolves around this supposed image of being non-binary, people like Act and Juniper, females, right? Like again, by the general audience, this is either ignored or straight up like laughed at, right? I have never seen anybody in any of my circles refer to Act as like a they them ever because everyone just knows that's a chick. Like again, that's all like a non-binary person could be is that like either it's a chick or it's a trap. Like Like there's nothing else it can be really. So when you look at it that way, like when you see just how badly the they them shit has collapsed, when you see how like people have rejected things like ideas like avatar characters being they thems, or like Juniper and Act being they thems, or now like Deku Scrubs being they thems, right? You see a complete and total rejection of that from the wider community. And the only thing that remains now, I think, is just to crush the communists outright. I do think that's the main takeaway from this is that we do need to start like pushing back against the agenda. Like I don't want this to be taught in schools. Like I don't want people to think this is correct English, and I don't want people like spending their entire careers trying to normalize it. It's something that absolutely has to stop.